Hello and welcome to this concluding session on chord substitution, and indeed the conclusion of all the chord work in this series. I'm probably going to tack on another little session on practice tips after this, but as far as the main theme of this course goes, we've reached the end. Here I'm going to discuss 4 more types of chord substitution, all of which relate one way or another to the dominant 7th chord. I'm going to begin with what are called secondary dominants. And to understand how these work, I'm going to return one last time to the minor key perfect cadence, that is the 5-1 progression. You'll remember that using the chords of the harmonised natural minor scale, this gave us a progression of 5 minor or 5 minor 7th to 1 minor or 1 minor 7th. In the key of A minor, this gives us a progression of E minor or E minor 7th to A minor or A minor 7th. All along we've been substituting this 5 minor chord with a 5 major or 5 dominant 7 chord, giving us E major to A minor or E7 to A minor or A minor 7, which has allowed us to restore the semitone movement from the major third of the 5 chord to the root of the 1 chord. Now let's consider another type of cadence, and that's the major key imperfect cadence. Now, an imperfect cadence is a cadence that ends on the 5 chord rather than returning to the 1 chord. In a major key, this means we end on a major or dominant 7 chord, in the case of C major, a G major, or G dominant 7. The preceding chord in an imperfect cadence can be one of many, but a very common choice is the 2 chord, giving us a 2-5 progression, that is to say 2 minor or 2 minor 7, 2 5 major, or indeed 5 dominant 7. Now let's consider what this progression has in common with the minor key perfect cadence. And there are 2 relevant features. One is that the first chord is a minor or minor 7th chord, and the second is that the chord root moves by an interval of 1/4. In the case of key of C major, that is from D minor or D minor 7 to G, and the root moves from D to G by 1/4. It follows that if we now replace the minor or minor 7th chord with a major or dominant 7th chord, we once again now have a semitone movement from the third of the 2 chord to the root of the 5 chord. So by altering the 2 chord, it has now taken on the character and function of a dominant chord, hence the term secondary dominants. And this principle can be applied to any sequence of 2 chords in which the first chord is a minor or minor 7th and the chord root moves by an interval of 1/4. Thus the 6-2 progression can become 6 dominant 7th to 2 minor, and the 3-6 progression can become 3 dominant 7th to 6 minor or minor 7th. The 3-6 progression, of course, hasn't featured in any of our common chord progressions. However, you can't help but notice that the 6-3 progression in a major key is the same 2 chords as the 5-1 progression or perfect cadence in the relative minor key. So in fact we've now come right back round to where we started. The next example I want to look at is something called blues 7ths. And this simply refers to the practice in blues and rock and roll styles of playing a 1-4-5 progression, playing every chord as the dominant 7th form. So we have a 1-7, a 4-7 and a 5-7. not unusual to find some kind of riff built around the dominant seventh arpeggio, following the chords around the progression. And so forth. When it comes to finding chord scales to provide your melody and lead lines to accompany this chord progression, well, the 5 dominant 7 is of course our normal dominant 7th chord, and the Mixolydian mode is appropriate, bearing in mind the way the blues wavers between major and minor without ever actually being either one or the other. The Mixolydian flat 6 is also an option in this case. The 4 dominant 7 chord can be thought of as a borrowing from the harmonised melodic minor scale, so an appropriate mode for this would be the 4th mode of the melodic minor, that is the Lydian flat 7 mode. The 1/7 chord is entirely new to this formulation, and here the Mixolydian mode again is an appropriate choice for this chord. Of course, this being the blues, you could leave the modes to one side and take some variant of the blues scale as the basis for your melodies and lead lines. My next example is a type of substitution that's very popular in jazz styles, and this is the tritone or flat 5 substitution. Now, the word tritone simply means an interval of 3 tones, or a flattened or diminished fifth. The tritone or flat 5 substitution is a substitution for the 5 or dominant 7th chord, and again particularly useful when it's used in a cadence. And it simply means taking a normal dominant 7th chord, here in the key of C major, our familiar G7 chord, and replacing it with another dominant 7th chord with the root raised by a tritone or a flattened fifth, in this case to D flat 7. Why should this work? Well, to get an idea, let's look once again at the structure of the chords. If we play our normal dominant 7 to 1 chord perfect cadence, we have, as always, the semitone movement from the 3rd of the 5 chord to the root of the 1 chord, and when we use the 7th chord there is a mirrored semitone movement from the 7th of the 5 chord to the 3rd of the 1 chord. In the case of the G7 chord, the chord is built of the root G, the 3rd B, 5th D, and 7th F. Now let's look at the structure of the chord that we find when we move the root by a flattened fifth. Here we have root D flat, and now a 3rd of F, 5th A flat, and the 7th B. So the crucial notes of B and F are still present in the new chord. They've just reversed their roles in the chord structure, in that F has now become the 3rd and B has now become the 7th. So when we play the cadential formula from D flat 7 to C, we still have this mirrored semitone movement from F to E and B to C. For my final example, I'm going to look at diminished 7th substitutions. This is another substitution for the dominant 7th chord. Recalling that in most guitar music all diminished chords are played as diminished 7th, so diminished and diminished 7ths are for us effectively synonymous. To understand how this can be an effective substitution, let's look once again at the structure of the dominant seventh chord. This time in arpeggio form. We have the major third. From the major third to the fifth we have a minor third, and from the fifth to the dominant seventh another minor third. This means that the top three notes of the chord, the third, fifth and seventh, form a diminished triad, that is to say a triad of all minor thirds. And we can turn this into a full diminished seventh chord simply by altering the root note, moving it up one semitone to give us a minor third. If we now put this chord into a perfect cadence, that is replacing G7 to C with G sharp diminished 7 to C, all but one of the notes of the chord progression remain the same, and most importantly that crucial B to C and F to E movement is retained. The diminished seventh substitution is another one popular in jazz styles, but also has a long and honourable history in classical music. And just one concluding word on chord scales. In the case of the diminished or diminished seventh chord, then obviously the diminished scale is the obvious one to go for. In the case of the tritone substitution, it turns out that once again the Lydian flat 7 is a suitable mode to use against this substitute chord. And now we've reached the end. Obviously there's a great deal more to learn about the topic of chords, harmony and music theory generally, and indeed there's probably a great deal more still to be discovered or invented. However, I hope that this little series of videos has given you some good grounding in the essentials of music theory, and most importantly how these principles can be applied in a practical way to guide you towards improving your guitar technique and also your composing and improvisational skills. As I said at the beginning, there will probably be one more session to follow this with what I hope will be another useful addition to your practice routine, so I'm not going to say goodbye just yet.